Okay, in a retaliatory diplomatic move, Beijing expelled a Canadian diplomat on Tuesday. This after Minister of Foreign Affairs Melanie Joly declared a Chinese diplomat persona non grata on Monday. Zhao Wei, who worked in China's Toronto consulate, stands accused of targeting Conservative MP Michael Chong and his family in 2021. Chong had sponsored a motion condemning Beijing's treatment of the Uyghur minority population. Zhao must leave the country by the end of the week.
It is a decision that was taken based on considering many factors and also many of Canada's interests in the world, including in China. And so it needed to be thoughtful, it needed to take some time, and we needed to make sure that we did this in a very serious manner.
Okay, we're going to get some reaction to this. Peter MacKay is a former Conservative Foreign Affairs Minister, and he joins me now. Mr. MacKay, it's good to talk to you again.
Always a pleasure, David.
China's response to Zhao Wei's expulsion is a one-for-one measure, essentially a tit-for-tat, a diplomat for a diplomat. Is that what you expected to see?
Absolutely, very predictable. And as we have seen in previous instances with China, including the two Michaels, they don't waste any time. They move very quickly to send a message. And it's always accompanied with accusatory rhetoric and an effort to indicate that somehow Canada has been the provocateur. In this case, that's simply not true, of course.
Yeah, Canada's foreign minister took a week to do this. The Chinese foreign ministry took about 12 hours, I think, from when it was officially announced before they responded. So they've said, China's foreign ministry says they reserve the right to respond further. So in your assessment, is there a risk here that China does escalate?
They very well may. I mean, they don't have that troublesome democratic process to have to go through. It's a very small number of people in the Chinese Communist Party that dictate policy, and they may. There's obviously other retaliatory measures, including trade, including possible expulsion of other people or arrests, as we saw in the case of the two Michaels. China is extremely aggressive these days and has demonstrated in the past that they really don't play by any international set of rules or conventions.
You know, Beijing reportedly targeted Michael Chong and his family over his motion in 2021 that condemned China's treatment of the Uyghurs. Why do you think Beijing feels it's okay to target elected members of parliament in this way?
Well, it shouldn't be okay to target citizens of any country, elected or otherwise. Michael Chong is an unlikely person. He's a privy councillor. He's somebody who's very principled, very articulate. And that's perhaps why he was targeted, to make an example of him. It just so happens that he had family in Shanghai. We've seen Kenny Chiu as one of the individuals in British Columbia who happened to have been a Conservative MP and had forwarded a motion with respect to a foreign influence registry, which also got under the skin of Beijing. And that is one of the ridings, as you know, that may have been targeted in terms of electoral interference. So there's a lot of moving parts here, including proxy police stations that have been set up in Canada, apparently, and in other countries as well. And so China is on the move and sending a very forward-leaning, aggressive motion that anyone who opposes them or speaks out is a potential target.
The diaspora community here in Canada, particularly the dissidents who testified at committee today and speak out, they say they've been targeted by Beijing for years. And I know you had some experience with this when you were the foreign minister. What can you tell me about that?
Well, I can tell you that, yes, expulsion is a very serious step to take. But when we have Canadians traveling abroad in countries like China, it is something that the country has to very much lean into and send a clear message, not just to our allies, but to our adversaries as well. And I recall vividly speaking up on behalf of a Canadian citizen, Hussein Jalil, who went back to China to assist his parents. He was a Uyghur. He was actually in Uzbekistan, a neighboring country, when he was arrested and deported back to China. And he's still there, in spite of efforts by many, including myself. They don't recognize him as a Canadian citizen. And that is something that other countries, including Iran and Syria and others, they don't recognize a citizen who has migrated to a country like ours.
You know, we've got 2 weeks from today. Special Rapporteur David Johnston has to decide whether or not there's going to be a public inquiry into this whole thing of Beijing-backed foreign interference. With everything now that we know publicly, do you believe he has any option but recommend a public inquiry?
I don't. And without getting into the sort of the partisan side of it and whether he's the appropriate person, I think there's mounting evidence now that suggests that we go further, including just snippets of what we know that came from CSIS, which came obviously to Michael Chong and others, and had expressed concerns. And in fact, at the core of all of this is when and what was told to the Prime Minister's office, and what did they do or not do about it. And so that's why I think the drumbeat to have a completely impartial process, a judicial inquiry, a public inquiry that pulls back all of the curtains, puts shines a bright light on what was taking place here. This is a fundamental cornerstone of our democracy, David, as you know, and having people from other countries operating inside our country, influencing our citizens, influencing our electoral results, it shakes people to the core, and it demands a very serious response.
On this latest incident of this intelligence report being sent to the National Security Advisor, to the Prime Minister, and apparently to the relevant ministries, but presumably not making it to the Prime Minister and the relevant ministers of the day. Ian Brodie, who is Prime Minister Harper's Chief of Staff, was on the show Friday, and he says if something like that had come in when he was Chief of Staff, that would have landed on his desk pretty quickly. What's your experience when you were in Foreign Affairs if something similar to this had made it into your department?
I absolutely agree. And I chaired the National Security Council for our party. We had incidents like this, which I can't refer to, but involved Syria, Russia, Iran. And absolutely, that goes to the very top of the government, the Prime Minister's office, and the requisite ministers' offices, security responsibilities. I would find it absurd, passing strange, that a matter of this seriousness did not make it directly to the Prime Minister himself.
What if it didn't? If we take the explanation at face value, what does it tell you if it didn't get there? How does something like that possibly happen?
Well, David, as I said, my opinion is that it had to get there. And if it didn't, there is a massive gap or incompetence somewhere in our chain of command of important top secret information for which CSIS is tasked. That type of information, which, as I said, goes to the very core of our democratic system, and most importantly, the security and safety of Canadian citizens, to be free from intimidation and foreign influence and threats, or worse, it would require, in my opinion, a public inquiry into just that, the competence of our national security apparatus, if it is not reaching the highest office in our country.
Okay, former Foreign Affairs Minister Peter MacKay, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, David.
My next guest testified before a House of Commons committee earlier today on the issue of Beijing-backed foreign interference. Ayman Lau is an advisor with Alliance Canada Hong Kong and a research analyst at Double Think Lab, and Ms. Lau joins me now from Taipei. Ayman, thank you so much for joining us. You've been warning about interference by Chinese state and Chinese actors for quite some time, and the Canadian government has now, for the first time that we know of, expelled a Chinese diplomat for this kind of activity. What's your reaction to this move?
In terms of the reaction to the move, I am quite encouraged to see Canada finally taking a step towards taking a stand against these types of activities that are perpetuated by the PRC. Certainly think that this was the right move, and it sends a strong message.
What do you make of Canada's, of China's response, that they have also expelled a Canadian diplomat? Do you think that could be the end of it, or do you fear Beijing could escalate beyond just this tit-for-tat kind of move?
Quite frankly, not surprised by the fact that Beijing has decided to expel a Canadian diplomat as well. We know that the PRC likes to engage in retaliatory measures once in response to unfavorable actions or policies from foreign countries, as well as I believe that we can expect further retaliation in other forms, potentially economic sanctions or potentially freezing more Canada-China relations as well in the future.
So Zhao Wei is the first Chinese diplomat kicked out, but the second Chinese diplomat to be publicly named in the foreign interference reporting. The first, Tang Xiaoling, left the country before her name became public in some of this reporting. What's your sense of how widespread this is with Chinese diplomats, how involved they are in these types of operations in Canada?
I think for years especially within the dissident communities, we've always had our suspicions that the Chinese diplomats certainly play an influential role in producing disinformation and intimidating and surveilling the community. However, it is very difficult to make such a claim, as our evidence tends to be. It's quite difficult to gather evidence, is what I mean to say. But we do see certain incidences that do occur where we see brazen attacks by Chinese diplomats. One good example would be what happened in the UK a few months ago, where the Hong Kong protester was dragged onto embassy grounds and beaten by Chinese diplomats and several staff members.
So, I mean, we haven't seen anything like that in Canada, as far as I know. I just wonder, though, this expulsion of this diplomat, do you think that will cause Beijing to think twice or recalibrate how it approaches foreign interference operations in Canada? I spoke to the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs last night on the show, and he said, we hope Beijing gets the message that they'll just stop. How do you think they'll approach it?
Certainly, I think we need to always understand that foreign interference and influence operations are constantly evolving. And certainly new techniques are being tried, new strategies. So with the expulsion of the Chinese diplomat, it's hard to say at this time whether or not the approach will shift or change. However, we can always expect that the PRC will be looking for new strategies.
So do you think they would escalate their foreign interference operations in Canada, or do you think this might cause them to cool it for a little bit, just to lower the temperature? How do you think it might go in the short term?
In the short term, potentially because there's so much attention on this issue at the moment, they could potentially cool their operations and certainly engage in more covert operations than in the past. However, I think that we will see an evolution of foreign interference operations, and we have to be prepared for it.
What is the concern? I wonder, do you think they could increase target on the diaspora community? Like, if relations between Canada and China become more fraught and more tense in the wake of Canada making this move, you know, you and your colleagues with Alliance Canada Hong Kong have talked about how the diaspora community is targeted, how they're pressured, and, you know, how they're intimidated. Do you worry that a level of escalation could happen there in the wake of all of this?
To be honest, I think that no matter what, the diaspora will always bear the brunt of foreign interference and influence operations and surveillance. Certainly, we see it occurring in very politically sensitive times. I think back to the 2019 Hong Kong protests, especially within the diaspora overseas who were engaging in public-facing protests. There was a much higher level of surveillance and intimidation going on. I do believe that we will see potentially a much more thoughtful approach in how foreign interference and surveillance might look and how it targets the diaspora in the future.
Do you think Canada's finally taking this as seriously as they should have? I know your group has advocated for this for years. Do you think it took the Michael Chong situation for Canada to respond to this in a way that was appropriate? What's your sense on the government response now?
I will say that it is quite concerning that a sitting MP was not initially warned that their family could have been targeted. And that also leads me to ask, what about everyday Canadians who are targeted and surveyed and have families that are threatened overseas? Where do we turn to? And I think that's a question Canada needs to start asking and needs to start thinking about how we can provide support to these vulnerable communities. It is, though, certainly with recent news coming out of Canada, we are seeing encouraging steps, including I saw today that the Canadian universities are now going to be listing foreign organizations and proxies, and that could come at a cost at $100 million, which is not a small number whatsoever, but it is a good step forward. And we are seeing encouraging steps, including putting forth Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy as well late last year.
We're 2 weeks away, just as a final point, from one more big step, and that's when the special rapporteur who the Prime Minister appointed, David Johnson, to look into all of this, has to make a decision, a recommendation to the government on whether or not there will be a public inquiry into all of this. 2 weeks out from that deadline, do you think there's any doubt about the need for a public inquiry at this point?
I would say that my perspective, a public inquiry is a good first step and something that we need to, in Canada, I think Canada definitely needs to consider. However, I hope that we move beyond just a public inquiry and start to look at long-term sustainable solutions to countering foreign interference in Canada. It's certainly not just siloed to the ballot box on voting day, and it's a much more holistic and whole of society approach that we need to be taking.
Aiman Lau, thank you so much for your time.